Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to see pretty much full house inside this beautiful pavilion. It's not quite the midsummer solstice, which would have been completely perfect, but we're close. And it's a treat this evening. I think the plan is that we're going to speak for maybe 40-45 minutes. Hopefully we can then open things up. The conversation is going to be fairly organic. We have behind us, you will see images. Now, we're not following this in some prescriptive fashion, but hopefully some of the things we discuss will come up. There are captions, and that will help to particularly imagine, for those of you who haven't seen Neil's superb Stonehenge exhibition at the British Museum, which is on, Neil, for how much longer?
Until the 17th of July, so about 5 weeks left. Yeah.
So there's a sort of home straight, and make sure, if you haven't seen it, I mean, it's a very important show, so make sure you do. But it's a treat because we're talking about two brilliant exhibitions, and I actually, to my shame, only saw the one here for the first time today, and it's brilliant. It's a really fantastic show, and I know it's one that you, Hannah and Mary, have been planning for some time. It's clearly been slightly delayed by the pandemic, and the starting point, the launch pad, if you like, is this Stonehenge visit, right, that your father, Mary, undertook when he was quite young. I think around, is it 21, 22?
It was in 1921 when he was studying at the Royal College of Art, and he took a train from London and arrived in Salisbury, I think, in the evening. Was it in the winter? Was it sort of late autumn?
Last
October?
week of September, we think, in 1921.
And he couldn't wait to see Stonehenge, so he walked to the monument, I think, which was like 4 miles, and he saw it by moonlight. And he said that moonlight always makes things larger, more intense, more mysterious. So this first sighting of them by moonlight, I think, was a sort of seminal moment. And then he visited Stonehenge probably 21 times, many times in his life after that. And I went to school in Wiltshire or Dorset, and they would come and take me out on the weekend, and they'd stay in Salisbury at the County Hotel, I think room 18 and room 17, I looked it up. And back in the 50s in Salisbury on a Sunday, there was no place to go, no cinemas, so we would go to Stonehenge, whatever the weather, come rain, come shine. So I've seen it many times,
yes.
And I think there's a picture of me looking incredibly in a Macintosh at Stonehenge.
Which we do have. Well, Hannah, the thing I really wanted to know is that, so there's this seminal moment, and clearly he comes back to Stonehenge much later, half a century later, with the lithographs. I know we'll talk about those. Yeah. But in terms of the show, why did you want to use this as a sort of launch pad, if you like, this visit? What was your ambition?
Well, it was in discussion really with the team here at Hauser Wirth, Somerset, who often quite liked to connect the exhibitions that they do to the local community and to a local kind of audience. And this, driving from Perry Green in Hertfordshire, which was where Henry Moore lived and where the headquarters of the Henry Moore Foundation are now, down to Somerset, you can't avoid driving past Stonehenge. And of course, we knew that Henry Moore had made this visit to Stonehenge, and we knew how, we knew about the lithographs, of course, but it was really interesting for me to think about, if that visit's made in 1921, and the lithographs aren't made till 1972, 73, what's the immediate impact of that? And so the starting point was to think about this gallery in particular and what would make sense here, and it very quickly led me to start looking at some of the notebook pages that he's making, that these notebook sketchbooks that he has in the 20s, and what are the lessons that he learns from that very kind of seminal visit, from that experience of seeing this monument by moonlight.
And the notebooks, what was in the notebooks specifically that relates to Stonehenge? Is it this idea of sort of megaliths, sculptures as megaliths?
It's not explicit. It's a sort of internalised experience of these monumental forms in the landscape, and that's the other thread that we really wanted to bring out in this exhibition, which is about how Moore becomes famous, and we can showcase that here, for citing monumental sculpture in the landscape. This is an extremely important aspect of his work. And so we wanted to kind of use Stonehenge as a starting point to reach that end point, really. It wasn't intended that the whole exhibition would necessarily be about Stonehenge, but really those principles of citing sculpture in landscape, this kind of brilliant chemistry that happens when you have mankind, man-made forms, sculpture, Stonehenge more thought about as a sculpture in many ways,
I wonder if
and the land.
I mean, it maybe is a good moment to bring in Neil, because this idea that Moore understood Stonehenge as a work of art, as a self-respecting archaeologist of great standing, was he correct to think about it like that? I don't want to open a can of worms here about Stonehenge and its purpose, but
no, I mean, I think it's fair to say when I came, I've seen the lithographs before in reproduction, but when you see the works in the gallery, I think they have a real vibrancy to them, and they blew me away. And what you realise is that in the 70s, and presumably before, if you follow Hannah's logic back to the 20s, the stones meant something to him that perhaps as archaeologists we're only starting to realise, the sort of layers of meaning, the deeper psychological capacity of the material from this time period. It's not simplistic. For many years we've thought of it as that, but we're realising now, and in some ways, I mean, I don't want to set up a kind of simplistic narrative, but in some ways artists like Moore and Hepworth were ahead of the curve in understanding the importance of those forms and shapes and what people were trying to do with them through time. And I think that's something that I really took away from the walk around I had today. Yeah.
Is there a particular moment in terms of the history of Stonehenge and its interpretation? Different ages obviously think about Stonehenge in very different ways. You know, someone like Inigo Jones, 17th century, thought it was built by the Romans. What's going on in the early years of the 20th century that means people like Moore and others are really fascinated by Stonehenge?
Oh, I think there's so much happening. So, I mean, I think each decade has its own. I mean, in the exhibition we have a quote which is, "Every generation gets the Stonehenge it deserves or desires." It's quite a famous quote amongst archaeologists. So I think every generation of artists has always seen it through their own conditions and their own society, and I think that's why it's such a lightning rod. And you know, it's fascinating that this exhibition starts with Stonehenge and uses it as a gateway, because that's exactly what we were trying to do as well. We couldn't bring Stonehenge to the exhibition, and there are people from English Heritage here, so I don't want to blame them. But we couldn't do it. But what we could do is essentially what the exhibition does, which is to riff, to say, okay, the Stonehenge is well known, but how can we, you know, like the lithographs, it's a way in. How can we explore the objects from the same time period and from other parts of Britain and Europe, and sort of understand more of the meaning of the monument by putting it in context? So it's very interesting to hear Hannah say that. I hadn't quite realised that the logic of building the exhibition was very similar to what we were doing.
Stonehenge isn't the only point of convergence here, because Moore, particularly at the same period with that first visit, he's really fascinated when he arrives in London with the British Museum, right? With the collections there. What was he going to look at, and what was he so excited about?
Well, I think that he talks very strongly about how he was trying to break the shackles of the classical experience. And in art schools prior to Moore, people had been taught to draw from plaster casts of Michelangelo and various classical Greek sculptures. And there was a movement towards the non-classical. I mean, they called it the primitive art then, but possibly we'd call it non-classical now, where there was a sudden interest in the work of many, many other nations across time. And my father wrote about this wrote about being a sculptor and, looking at the art of Mesopotamia and Neolithic art and Sumerian art and Indian art and art from Africa. And I think many artists at that time were doing it to get away from pure physical sort of, oh God, I can't think of the word, when something is realistic, when you're trying to do a realistic presentation of something, and moving more towards the abstract and the meaning and emotional meaning within those things. And he started at that time, he joined in a movement that was called direct carving, whereas before in art schools you'd been taught to carve things or reproduce things by measuring these models, these Greek models of sculptures, or the the classical poses. And I think as one of the tests, he had to choose a Michelangelo. So he chose a Michelangelo, but he worked out its dimensions entirely by eye. But in order to fool the examiners, he put in pointing marks, e.g. measuring marks, in his copy, but it actually had been done by eye. And I have to say, growing up, my entire experience with my father was all about measuring distance, or sensing where the middle of something was, or the weight of something was.
As in, he would encourage you to guess, work it out, estimate.
Yes, so he was always, you know, and he talks about how space, you know, how you measure space by looking at the stars and the distance of the stars from the moon and the earth. And these were surely measurements that primitive man had to be using, you know, without a measuring tool, without a measuring stick. It was a natural way of measuring things.
Clearly there's a wonderful moment in the exhibition which you're responsible for yourself, Mary, which I think it's called the Pigsty, that gallery.
Yes.
And we've seen a picture of it, but there's the display case, and you've selected a large number of objects from Moore's own collection, from your family home. How did you go about choosing them?
Well, in that Pigsty selection, there's things from his studio, and things from the house, things from his collection, and also small maquettes that he might have made, and also natural objects that he would have found and collected throughout his life. And growing up with my father, because the wonderful thing about growing up with sculptors make actually quite good dads, because they're very practical, and they know, you know, how to make things and do things, and they're always on call. They're at home 24 hours a day. You go in and out of their studio.
That was allowed, was it? Because, I mean,
absolutely.
For example, this week, Paula Rego, very sadly, has just died.
I know.
My understanding there is that she did not let children into the studio.
I understand that is because she was a woman artist, and I think what she had to do, which my father didn't have to do, was separate being a mother and her maternal duties from actually her own sort of free spirit when she was in the studio. My father, even though in a way he was my mother as well, allowed me...
What do you mean by that? Because I've heard you say that before.
My mother was a refugee from Kiev. She was a Russian immigrant. And in a way, she had no mother. She'd been deserted by her mother. Whereas my father was the youngest child of 7 children, and so had enormous kind of sense of community and things. And in a way, I think he had much more sort of instinct towards a kind of familiarity than my mother did. But back to the studio. So I went in and out of the studio, and I could see that the house and the studio were interchangeable spaces, because he used my mother's saucepans to melt lead, to make lead sculpture, which made her, you know, yes, she had. And he used spoons, and he used tennis balls that we'd thrown for the dog, which he would cut in half and mix plaster in those bowls. So objects from the house, spoons, toothbrushes, found their way into the studio, and likewise, so there was the house in the studio, but also what I wanted to contain within that cabinet was the items that he had around him in the house, like stones and pieces of wood and bones and things like that.
And did he talk much about why? Because famously, I think it begins in the 20s, he becomes interested in bones and things from the landscape, but later in the career, they really become these sources, right, for bigger sculptures.
Yes.
Did he explain why he was so drawn to these things?
Yes, I mean, it's a sort of process. I think what we have to remember is at the beginning of his life, when he was living in Castleford, and he talks about the slag heaps as having this monumental presence like pyramids, and also his how he went to Adel Rock, which is this rock in the landscape, I think, in Yorkshire, and how impressive and stern and extraordinary it was. And also, I think he played in sand caves as a child in the cliffs near Castleford, where they would go inside these caves with a match, and the light of the match would go out, and he would be within this space, as we are actually in this building, and he got a sense of internal space. So I think through his childhood, you know, the sense of the monumental and the overpowering things in the landscape, but also an internal space, was inculcated in him and developed within him.
In a moment, I clearly want to bring Hannah and Neil back in, but just to finish the thing with the pigsty, because something that strikes me about it is there's a tremendous, you've already described it with the saucepans, a sort of homeliness and quite a modest quality to some of the objects. And something you've said before, when I met you a few years ago and we did an interview together, you said, it never ceases to amaze me how your father, my father, could go into this realm of the artist and then just sort of turn it off at the end of the day. Could you just describe that a little bit?
Well, but then we're jumping, you know, to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s when he was tremendously busy and he was seeing, you know, collectors or movie, you know, TV people, and he would have these immensely busy but organised days in which he'd do his letters and do various things, but and see movie crews and be enlarging this and maybe going to London. But in the evening, he could go into that studio, and in closing the door, he could reach within himself, because I think he could reach into his emotional and psychological truth and turn it all off and be able to kind of create things, which actually the two don't really go together, finding that internal part.
Well, and that sort of interior-exterior dynamic is such a key part of the work. That's something, I mean, there's a gallery at the end, Hannah, which you've devoted really to that. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's one of his central themes. I mean, by sort of 1930, really, Moore had hit upon the three sort of key themes that he kind of keeps returning to for the rest of his life. The reclining figure, probably the most sort of well-known, the mother and child, and almost as an extension of that idea of the mother and child, the internal-external form. But I kind of find that you don't have to look too hard to kind of actually go back to those early 1920s notebooks, for example, to see him almost intuitively moving towards this idea of internal external form. And actually it's a focus of that last gallery, the Bourgeois Gallery, but actually it comes throughout the show, I think. I mean, it comes in the very beginning when you're greeted by the arch at the open, at the gallery entrance, and you know, it is essentially an internal external form, because you're sort of, it's an arch, you're intended to walk through it, to inhabit that space. The sort of negative space held inside that arch is as much a part of the sculpture and the work as the sort of linear form that circumscribes it. So I'm really fascinated to hear you say that it's almost like an extension of the mother and child motif, because it's very noticeable that you have not got the famous Moore motif of the mother and child in the show. Similarly, there are lots of vertical forms rather than the reclining figures. And yet I found myself looking at, for example, some of the helmets at the end and thinking, this is an embrace as much as a sort of defensive enclosure. And it feels like a similar dynamic is going on between, which you find in the mother and children sculptures.
There's a sort of ambivalence, I think, with the helmet head sculptures, but maybe less so. I think there's, hopefully in that last gallery, we're looking at different modes of him exploring that idea of the internal external. So with the helmets, there's a sort of ambivalence between protection and entrapment. There's little internal figures that almost seem like they are representative somehow of our consciousness, that sort of these very militaristic encasements kind of are in direct contrast almost to those very quite spindly figures inside, for example, the helmet of 1939. And then they develop, and you get that later helmet head where the form almost seems kind of like it's trying to burst out. They definitely share something with the upright internal external form, which is probably the one that appears most clearly sort of based on a womb-like uterine pod with a very human kind of figure inside, and there is a sort of fleshiness to that encasing, and yet at the same time it speaks to the stamen of flowers, more often mentioned, these kind of, or seed pods, these long elongated forms. So I think hopefully through the show there's a sense of multiple points of inspiration that Moore kind of assimilates, and I think for me, this sort of idea of starting with Stonehenge and incorporating everything from the bones, the stones, the things that he picks up, the things that you see in Mary's Pigsty Gallery, the things around the home. This is more kind of being fascinated by form, being fascinated by the oppositions that you can find.
But I think what he really understood, or what he pursued all his life and deeply understood, and this show is a very abstract show, so he said there's not a lot of figurative representation in it. He understood the strength, the kind of emotional meaning of the abstract, or how we all share, because we all share the same. We all have bodies. We all have heads. We all have arms and legs. We know male. We know female. We all have a shared experience, and within that shared experience, there are soft things that are soft, things that are hard. All of these experiences we grow up with, and they are unspoken. They are not narrative experiences. We internalize them, and so when we respond in a way to the abstract sculpture of Moore, what we're responding to are both these soft internal forms that we're all familiar with in our own bodies, but also the hard sort of outer protective forms and the nature of bones, and we all are used to space and distances. So he's giving these emotional meaning, and he said that he said, and I can't remember the wording, but he was absolutely sure that there is that across culture there is a psychological truth which is shared across all cultures in sculptural form, which is
a sort of archetype with almost.
I ought to find the wording. Really.
I think, Neil, you were about to come in there.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's those abstract qualities to the works that, and the fact that you haven't gone for the figurative explicitly, that really appeals to me, because at the time of Stonehenge, so say 5,000 years ago to 4,500 years ago, you wouldn't have found figurative art. And that's not because people weren't capable. They were capable of building monuments like Stonehenge, but the human form is not what holds people's attention. What holds their attention is experimenting with form, and if you come to the exhibition, you'll see, for instance, these remarkable stone balls, these sort of carved balls that are very, I dare not use it on this stage, but very sculptural.
They absolutely are.
And these are made from very hard stones, worked over hours and hours and hours. And people are really experimenting with form, and no two are the same. They're all individual in that sense, but all of a same sort of tradition of creating. And we're not sure what they're for. And one of my favourite moments in the run up to the exhibition opening was Grayson Perry came round, and everyone up to that point had asked me, what on earth are these used for? And he didn't ask me. And I said to him, Grayson, you didn't ask me. And he said, I know, but they're just the pieces of sculpture, the pieces of art. They speak to me in their form. And I think that's what people at that time were involved in the same explorations that Mary's just been talking about.
Can I ask Neil about, there's an object in the show which fascinated me, and I think, Hannah, you were very interested in it as well, and possibly Mary, we haven't spoken about it yet, but there's it's a mace head. Yeah. And what made me think of it just now, as you said, obviously it was non-representational. People weren't interested in the figure in that prehistoric moment. Yet within this mace head, the decoration, arguably, is this too far? Suggests a face with a beard, and the shaft hole could be the mouth. Is that an accurate reading?
That is an accurate reading, and in the same part of the exhibition, there's these chalk cylinders that also have what seem to be called the Folkton Drums, quite famous, and Moore would no doubt, I think, have seen them, because they were quite prominent in the British Museum galleries in the throughout the early part of the 20th century and beyond. And these seem to show little faces peeping out, almost like they've been swaddled in symbolism, in decoration. And what strikes me is in both those objects, you've got human forms, but they're entangled. They're almost infused with decoration and with sculptural form. I think that's
absolutely. I mean, when you were talking earlier and sort of saying, figurative art didn't exist. It's also, and you're saying, that's just not what held the symbolism is what was kind of I was thinking. It's not what carried meaning.
No.
The figure didn't carry meaning in the same way, and I think that's kind of appears to be a much later. And
a big part of that is the interaction between nature and culture. So I think it's a much more porous line between nature and culture at the time of Stonehenge, and up in the north of Britain, where you get solid geology, you get rock art that's pecked into the the bedrock over huge areas. Anyone that's been up to Kilmartin Glen will have seen these astonishing landscapes of art. And there's two things that reminds me of Moore in that sense. Is one is the sense that the art doesn't make sense out with the landscape context. And it's one of the least successful parts of our exhibition because you just can't do it. You have to see the art in the landscape to understand it. And I think that's very important. The second thing about them is that the bedrock has obviously been worked naturally by ice sheets, the glaciers, and yet people don't see necessarily a distinction between the marks they're making and the glacial marks. And I think that would have been true. There would have been myth, there would have been story, and they don't see the distinction.
But I had an experience with my father. I think we went to Les Aisies and we went to a rock face, just a rock in a field called Cap d'Abri, I think it was called. And my father showed me that it had been, it was in fact a carving of a horse, or the shape of the body of a horse. But my father pointed out that the natural shape of the rock itself had suggested the belly of a horse. And so I think, you know, in clouds, you say a cloud is like a, you know, an animal. I think these metaphors, or the way that we have similarities of form, or we experience them in nature, I think that is partly a sort of impulse in some of these things.
And the question I have for both of you actually is where does Moore get that? Where does he get that insight? Where's the drive coming from? Where's the stimulus?
I think that, you know, the fact that he started doing this direct carving, that he was carving in daylight throughout all the seasons, and as you've described, sites like Stonehenge or in prehistoric man, I mean, there was only daylight. You didn't have electric light. You weren't within an internalized space that was lit from within. And so you saw everything through changing seasons, through the change of a day and the change of winter to summer with long light at night. And I've even seen by torchlight, and I think we have to remember that they had fire, I've seen Norwegian sort of rock facial carvings that you see by torchlight, and suddenly these reliefs become alive and almost animated. So I think that natural day, the natural seasons animated these experiences. And I think my father, in a way, had this deep intuitive kind of connection with that.
There's also, I mean, in both shows, if you like, that fascination with material is so important, and the question of different types of stone, which for more, I mean, it seems to me sometimes he was drawn to a particular type, partly for, say, its Britishness, or as much as the kind of quality of its colour, or...
In direct carving, he exploited or used all the British quarries. So he used many different kinds of British stone, and all of them have different qualities. Some stone is hard, some stone is soft. And as I was saying to you, like being a tailor, you choose the kind of the form or the material to go with what you're making it from.
What's a good example of that?
Well, for instance, in the show, the two figures in travertine stone, which is a very sort of open stone, and often used in Italy just for pavements. That's a much simpler form because you don't want to get sharp edges. You can't, because it's so porous, it's going to open up. Whereas another, in the early carvings, in a harder stone like the serpentine, which is a very hard stone, that green stone, you really can't dig into it and make a hole in it and things like that, but you can make a very sharp edge. So you fit your form to your material.
And there's perhaps an emotional quality as well to that material, which would that have been something that in prehistory had a lot of associations?
Yeah, I mean, everything you've said makes a lot of sense to someone studying, like me, studying prehistoric stonework, because people knew their sources. They absolutely knew what they were looking at. They probably knew where it came from, even if that was beyond Britain. You know, we've got amazing jadeite axes in the exhibition, and there's a strong case that people knew these came from the top of mountaintops in the Alps. So that knowledge of the source and the power of the stone was known. And that goes back to Stonehenge, because of course the bluestones, famous bluestones, are brought to Salisbury Plain. It's remarkable, almost ridiculous distance, because presumably they had some power, meaning, ancestry to them that people wanted to bring with them. They wanted to have that with them and see it. And I have to constantly remind myself that stone isn't just stone, it's chalk and cheese, depending on what type of stone. So there's such a range of properties, as you've just described.
Chalk and cheese carved quite in quite similar way, because they're quite soft.
Oh dear.
But it's a kind of, it is actually one of those things that to just get back both to the British Museum, because it's one of the things that Moore talks about as admiring, particularly I think among these sort of Mexican Shack Moore figures. He loves the stoniness of them. So that's obviously something we have clear evidence that he's sort of appeals to him, same time as he's going to Stonehenge. And also actually in those early notebooks, he's jotting down kind of shorthand these things about opposition of masses, and the diagram that we've got up is his sort of almost like the mini henge that he creates in the back garden of his cottage in Kent that he acquires sort of in the 30s, and these blocks of stone that he's placing.
What is the mini henge? I don't quite understand.
Well, it's my expression. It wasn't intended. I mean, actually, now that I know that a henge is not a collection of stones, but actually a ditch and a mound.
Neil
it's not a henge at
said,
all.
don't bring that out. I've done my work.
An assortment of stone that Moore was collecting at the time, but he jots onto this notepad the types of stones that they are. And he's obviously thinking about and collecting them and thinking about exactly what you're talking about, Mary, that idea of what is going to work for what sort of forms. They're in the landscape. There's images of him carving them in the landscape. So these are those
but
blocks of
also
stone.
these photographs which he took, and he took photographs of his life, show his understanding of scale, because in a way he can make something that's really not very large. You know, they actually are quite small, look very large. So he has the understanding of the power of scale, both the very small, because he used to carry a stone with him all the time and roll it around in his hand, and he kind of was internalizing the form of that stone as he carried it in his hand, and in internalizing it, it was sort of going into his measuring intellect, and he was able to externalize. He was like a scanning machine, but kind of taught himself to be a human kind of scanner, really.
But I think touch is such an important part of the effect of his work.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the tension of it is about things which are almost touching, there's an electricity that comes from that.
Because he understands that space has as much power as actually the solid, and if you don't quite bring two things together, there's much more power in them not quite meeting, and Michelangelo knew that, no, so do many other people. You know, that actually that not quite touching is much more powerful possibly than them actually touching, or if they actually touch, then do they lock, like the huge locking form as we go back through the garden.
I mean, you're talking about he would always have a stone, he would touch it, and I think we've had a picture, hopefully we've seen it, of some of those, the ancient stone balls, or a mock-up of one being used in the hand.
They are tactile. I mean, it's one of the great sadnesses of putting things in cases from this period, is that they're all designed to be held and turned to be felt, and so on. But I think that, to go back to the idea of locking and of things coming together, what blows me away about the lithographs is that you're inside the circle and you're looking up close at those stones. That's a very different vision to the romantic Turner or Constable of the stone silhouette in the distance. And what I think you're getting at in that is the experience you have as a visitor to the stones. If you're lucky enough to get inside, and I know it can be tricky, but if you get inside, the stones almost do feel chaotic. They feel as if they're a jumble. And it's only when you are approaching the monument that you see it as its sort of silhouette, as its whole. And that's important because that's how people in the past also experienced it. And they would have, what's maybe not always as well understood is that the stones were designed to be seen on a sort of choreographed journey from the River Avon up to the stones. So you would have got a little bit of all those views, and the whole series of encounters was part of the Stonehenge experience. It wasn't just seeing it from afar, and it wasn't just seeing it from within. But to go back to within, I think what's important about that is that when you're inside it, there is an almost a chaotic, almost sort of primeval feel of things colliding and sort of coming together. And to my mind, that's what makes that opportunity to get inside the circle so exciting, because you feel like you're almost at the heart of the monument and of maybe of if it's not too grand a term, of the cosmos, because remembering that people who put this monument together were creating a microcosm, you're creating a kind of universe in one place. So when you're inside it, you're at the very beating heart. And I think that's what's so exciting about those lithographs, is it's almost like that Moore has understood the beating heart of the monument, and he's caught it somehow.
Neil, you're speaking so passionately and eloquently about Stonehenge, and I just wonder whether this is a good moment to think again about your show, not necessarily in relation to Moore, but just thinking about Stonehenge as a monument and how you've... Is there a new way that you're inviting us to think about it and look at it?
It's a very good question. I think in some ways, and this is a sort of... not the right answer. In some ways, we're trying to put Stonehenge in a wider context, in the sense that it has such interest to people, but there's so much beyond it. So I'd say if we're doing something new, it's about saying this is a portal into understanding a much bigger world. And actually, if you don't understand that bigger world, in the same way that if you don't understand the other amazing objects in the exhibition, you can't understand why anyone would do something so crazy as to build a monument like Stonehenge. So we kind of had to go out in order to come back in, if that makes sense.
So as in that bigger world being the people who used the monument, visited the monument, but also the landscape, which of course it's hard to convey in the show, but that's how you're thinking about situating it in that context.
And the social and cultural conditions in which the monument's made are as relevant as anything to understanding why it was made. So what's happening right across Europe is relevant to what's happening in that one point on Salisbury Plain. Yeah.
Is that something, I mean, that's a big theme of the show in a sense for you, Hannah, right? That sense of sculpture in the landscape.
Yeah, but the one thing that sort of struck me as Neil was talking then is this idea of the making and the people that made it. And one thing that we've talked about as I saw the show is this evidence of man's intervention with the stones. And I think it is a sort of, it's not about picturing Stonehenge, or it's for, you know, our conversation was very much about how there is evidence of this Neolithic carving, and that which Moore, I'm sure, would have absolutely seen and appreciated. This sort of, these stones are worked, and what does it take to work those stones?
They're in the lithographs. It's kind of working of the stone.
And we talked about the joints and how, you know, intricate and they are. And I think, this sort of perhaps speaks to that idea we mentioned earlier of this as a work of art. You know, this isn't a kind of, oh, there's some stones, we'll square them off a bit and pile them up. This is generations and generations of carving.
But I think what Moore, you know, to go back to Moore and then bring it back to Stonehenge, I think what Moore is often talking about, or in the lithographs that you found particularly exciting, Neil, where they're very black and you're kind of almost within an architectural space that's enclosing you, and he'd just prior to that been doing these etchings of an elephant skull that was given to him by Julian Huxley, the zoologist, and he starts off by just etching it, etching the outside form, but then he starts to turn the interiors of the skull almost into cavernous shapes or prison-like dungeons or cathedrals of space. The internal form becomes a cathedral of space. So in a way, he plays all the time with scale, as I said before. And in the carving room, there's a small piece called Architectural
Project. A project for a maze,
and it's just it's vertebra that he's sawn in half and cast in plaster, which is what my pigsty is meant to show, a little bit of his process, where you would press an object into clay and then cast it in plaster and then maybe carve the plaster as you would chalk, because it's very soft. He loved carving plaster. And he's created this maze. If you bend right down, even though the vertebrae are only this size, you could imagine yourself in a huge ruined city in a desert, or it's like almost a video game where you're going through enormous sort of ways between blocking objects. And I think that the real power of Moore is that he's able to move scale, because I think he puts the figure in the landscape. So in a way, you know, you see the landscape as a figure, and also you see the figure as a landscape, and he interchanges the two, though the two things are vastly different in their scale.
I feel like in the lithographs, the shock of them are the ones where it's so cropped, and you're so close up to the stones. It completely defamiliarizes the most iconic site, takes it away from, as Neil has said, Turner and Constable. It almost felt, this might be slightly weird to bring this up at this stage in proceedings, it almost felt erotic to me, at points that there's a sort of quality of like the proximity.
I wasn't ready for that.
Yeah, it was. I might get my coat. I'll keep that to myself. This is not being filmed. But I suppose what I mean by that, it's at night, it's moonlight, but there's a sort of real sense of intimacy with the subject, and there's almost like it could be flesh. There's a sort of texture to it. I sense I'm out on a limb here, but
I'm thinking there could have been a better link.
Yeah, there could have been. That was a bad segue. But it was compulsive. I had to unburden myself of that. But no, I mean, but certainly there's a sense real of claustrophobia, but the density of the material.
But I think you're right that he takes an organic form, perhaps like a seed or the inside of a seed. He takes organic form and he plays with the scale of it, and something that is very small, like sort of the internal parts of oneself, enlarged becomes something quite else, and you distance yourself. It's kind of abstractification. I don't know. Abstractification of the intimate, or even, you know, it's by taking a detail and enlarging it. We're so familiar with the meaning of it, perhaps.
I think this familiarity and strangeness is a really creative tension, and it's also the kind of what makes Moore's work so successful. When you take something like Locking Piece at the bottom of the garden, and you know, you can think of it as these sort of pieces of bone, but when it's taken to a different material, it's bronze, it's not bone. When it's enlarged beyond, you know, any kind of bone maybe, then it's placed in a landscape, it becomes a very deliberate act, and it does that thing, I think, of, you know, it's not natural.
But he
it's
also said
form,
about it that there was a toy which some of us very old people like us, which was a sort of thing where you locked a cap inside a kind of two metal shapes, and you would throw it on the ground and it would explode. So the locking of this metal cap is also meant to relate to, in a way, these discs that lock.
Could I come back to the familiar and strange and that tension? Because, you know, if you think about Stonehenge, the way it was built was using woodworking techniques, and there is a strong argument that this is a symbolic act where they're turning wood into stone. So wood is for the living and stone is for the ancestors. But what they're also doing is dressing the stone, and it's easy for us to forget because we're surrounded by worked stone all the time. But if you've never seen it, if you've only ever seen natural sarsen or natural stone, to see something that is so worked, that is so shaped beyond what you find in the natural world, and yet is drawing on woodworking techniques, you've got those sort of something that's familiar but is also strange at the same time. And I think you probably do have that intentional clash of those tensions.
I think perhaps it's a good moment to open it up to the audience. We do have two people with roving microphones, if there are any questions, in which case it might be a good idea to just wait for people to come around.
I don't know.
I mean, if not, we can continue, but there's a question down here. Ellie's on her way.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very, very interesting discussion. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a very specific question. In the glass case, are three coco de mer joined together?
Oh, yes.
My wife is from the Seychelles,
yes,
which is the only place that the coco de mer grows. So could you tell us?
Congratulations.
Tell us a little bit about the history. How it came into his possession.
I can't tell you a tremendous amount about the history of it, but I mean, my father was a man of habit, and every Saturday we would go to have lunch in Hertford, and we would often visit we also would go into kind of antique shops and things. And I think we found various things like fossilized. We have a fossilized tree trunk, things that had come from Victorian sort of a period of things that people had. We have many other sort of natural rock formations. I think he just saw, he saw it and we took it home and there it sits. And also my mother had some part in possibly seeing and collecting things as well. But we love it, and yeah.
A question at the back.
Yeah, thanks for a lovely evening. I've always been fascinated at the sheer physicality of producing sculpture. And so the energy that comes from the artist actually building and creating in a very physical way. So was your father a very fit, strong man?
Yes. But also he had incredible stamina. And also if you're going to do a lot of work, most people, be they writers, well, maybe not writers always.
Hang about. Take my eye off the ball for 1 second. Yeah.
Sorry. But often have a very rigorous kind of work routine, and he had an incredibly he split his day into, in order to optimize the amount that he could achieve in one day. The day was split up into parts. He had a siesta, which wasn't very common in those days. He always took a siesta. And he had tremendous stamina, but also, and a tremendous work ethic. I mean, when we look back at his diaries during, before we made the Henry Moore Foundation, he had like 1 or 2 secretaries. He had my mother. He had possibly 2 or sometimes 3 assistants in the studio, but not a lot of assistants. So probably 5 people or 6 people did what now sort of possibly 27 people do, because he took his own photographs, he contributed to books. I think a lot of people who do a lot, in particular sculptors, they're very practical and they kind of know how to divide their work up, but he was very strong. Richard.
Richard, there's a mic 2 seconds away.
I'm only going to speak because Mary gave me the eye, because I worked there briefly. And I was going to say that I think the average age in here is probably over 50. And so you're the last people who probably know what a set of chisels look like, or a claw hammer. And you might even know that a bolster is a tool as well as something you might sleep on. So if we flip this audience upside down and everybody was, let's say, 30, well, that would be the average age, everybody would speak festool and Makita. So the noises that I'm being wagged at by somebody's going to speak. You've got another speaker. The point I wanted to make was that how things are very old-fashioned words like wrought and fashioned. Everybody here, whether you know it or not, you witnessed it. And that's now
defunct.
No, it's not defunct. It's just very, very, very diminished. And you can test it by walking past a building site, because what do you hear? You do not hear tappity tap 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 tap. You hear, I'm only going to make the noise. And I think that this thing about work and the work ethic and materiality and the fact that we often are very sloppy about the way we say shape and form, they get interchanged. And I think the great thing about the way that Neil spoke is that the incredibly strong sense of just making something stand up. Mm-hmm. That's why you give children bricks, and children didn't get bricks until we had nice floors. So bricks didn't really enter the world of bourgeois play until I think the Georgian times, because they finally got a few floors that were more or less true. You can check that with I heard that somewhere. But I mean, actually piling things up, making things go up and stay up, and I think that's huge in Stonehenge, and no one's, I don't think anyone has said architecture, but that lurks in these things about when everybody here has been through a gate. You know, when you go through a gate, you are going through a really serious piece of statement. You know, mine, thine, yours, not yours, get out. Very ritual kind of place, and I think that's hugely in everything you've been talking about.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah. I agree. I think it comes in with that idea of closure as well.
Thank you. I've got a question either for for Hannah or for Mary concerning the stone maze piece, and I believe it says Hill Project in some of the documentation for it, and in quite a late interview that he did with John Reed, I think Henry said it was to be an underground piece, sort of reminiscent of his childhood experiences in Castleford, and I wondered if either of you knew where it made this imaginative leap from being on top of a hill to being underground.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he was possibly imagining, I don't know, because I'm not familiar with the context, but I mean, we're talking about a change of light or a change of, you know, I mean, you're talking about underground, therefore it's in the dark, so you're kind of feeling away, rather than it being in direct sort of light. I've seen it in a way as being in a desert, and very like, I think we've got a picture of a monument, a broken monument that he drew that lies in a kind of desert, but it's broken into sections. So it's like coming upon a ruin or something that has a hidden meaning. I think he's. What is the reference to John Reed and it being in the dark?
It's in a book that John Reed wrote. John Reed was BBC.
Yes, I remember him well.
A number of documentaries.
Yeah, he was one. Wasn't he the son? Wasn't he related to Herbert Reed? Yeah.
And it appears that there's a sort of regret that it won't be finished because it's going to take sort of 10 years.
Well, you need a lot of concrete.
I have a recollection of this as well. I don't remember actually it going underground, which I actually find really fascinating, especially having just seen Neil's show and thinking about them digging down into these kind of tomb chambers and so on, or actually those being erected above ground as well. But one thing I would say is there are other, so in your case, Mary, I think you have another little project for Hill Monument, which is those three little figures with a little kind of almost conical hat on top.
The fact that he works through ideas and sometimes doesn't do them.
Exactly.
The whole point is that,
I think he was experimenting with a number of ideas, some of which were going to end up on this potential hill. And actually those three relate to the way that he would later go on to display the upright motives with these kind of groupings and what happens when you group things versus sort of line them up, or which is something we're exploring in the threshing barn. But I'm really actually quite interested in this idea of it kind of being somehow internalized underground. But I suspect that there is an element of that same idea finding expression in a number of ways.
I think he might have said underground because at the time that he was doing the elephant skull, he was looking at the drawings of Piranesi, and he was also, and thinking about these dungeons and these subterranean kind of spaces, so he was possibly channeling that thought.
Did the gentleman in the blue shirt have a question?
Just a little comment with regards to the tools. There's a chink of hope because I've been a violin maker for 32 years and I use less than 5% of my time machines, I think. But my daughter is a wood carver and uses chisels, and her husband is a stone carver.
Excellent.
So they do still exist. They are and another point about flat floors. They existed before Edwardian days because we have a William and Mary floor which is flatter than anything people could do with their festival games.
On the tools. Sorry,
No.
I was just going to say it was another point of kind of convergence when we were looking at in and around Neil's exhibition these incredible axe heads, and that kind of idea of the tool actually being an object of beauty and of art in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of these axe heads are beautiful things, but you know, the danger then is to sort of fetishize them and think of them as symbols. But actually, you know, they're functional tools, but they're things that people put a lot of time and energy into, and that goes for the handles as well of tools, which are often forgotten, the wooden components and so on. So yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The coming together of function and meaning is very important in prehistory anyway.
I know we should wrap up very soon, but I think there were a couple more maybe last questions. The lady here with the scarf.
A couple of things. One personal note. I did meet your father. I interpreted for him in Munich.
Oh.
He had an exhibition in the 70s,
Yes.
70s in Munich.
Excellent.
So I met him and he was lovely.
Thank
I
you.
to say, he was very, very alive and an inspirational person.
Was he very strong and fit and could you
My question is, I mean, he's so visual. I mean, he's such a good draftsman, all of that. And yet, you know, you're talking about his sculptures coming from within.
Yeah. Well,
but did he use models at all for his?
Yes, I mean, he used a lot. He did a lot of life drawing. You know, when he was at college, and he would go to draw in Paris as well. You could buy a cahier and you could draw life drawings in a. I did that as well. And he used drawing. To develop ideas, but also to kind of, his drawings are mostly three-dimensional and talking tremendously about three-dimensional space, and very much concerned with their sort of sculpture, you know, even if they're figures, they have a sculptural form, or the leg comes forward. In fact, I did a bit of drawing and did a bit of illustration, and he couldn't wait, you know, he used to correct, it was not correct, he used to add to and sort of emphasize certain aspects of one's drawings. But I mean, if a drawing makes you think, it makes you, it's incredibly good, because you have to really think, what is something bigger than something else? Is it further back? You know, it makes you into a scientist, really, and, you know, it helps you measure with your eye.
One of my favourite quotes about Moore and drawing, which links to the earlier comment, is he says, drawing keeps you visually fit.
Yes, yes, no, it's jolly difficult, actually, to draw well.
I think we have one last question over here. Sorry. No.
Nice that you met my son. Ask you about that, it's great.
It's maybe not the most very loud. I was just on that kind of idea of tools and things like that, and I'm not trying to get away with not having to go to the exhibition. But what kind of tools did they use to, like, you were talking about them kind of carving the rocks at the, what are they called, megaliths at Stonehenge? What kind of tools did they use to kind of carve them?
Stone tools, at least in the before the introduction of metal. So in the exhibition, we've got some of these hammer stones, and they're sarsen stones that they're using to bash at the sarsen. And I find, you know, you can walk past that case and think it's not interesting, but actually, when you read what they are, I find them really fascinating. And what that's about, I think, is about making Stonehenge not that picture postcard that we're used to, but actually a site of creation and creativity, and people actually working those stones generation after generation. And that's what I try and remember when I see them, is that there was a time when they were being made, and that was an incredible act.
I think the other thing that struck me was the variety of stone that was used, and the beautiful range of colour, and I mean, the shape is all sort of fairly uniform, but then they become slightly more elaborate, they become I don't know, presumably more they lean towards the more kind of decorative, not because they weren't being used, but because they've been worked in such a way. So there's a pride in tool making.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's, I don't want to say it's universal, but it does feel very constant, that pride in the tools you use. I think they're an extension of the artist, aren't they? They're an extension of the body.
Three words.
Yes.
There's a ghost in the room, for those of you who are interested, and he's called David Pye. And Mr. Violin and I will know who David Pye is, and your dad would definitely have known who David Pye was, but all about how and why things are made, and hardness and sharpness, absolutely what you guys are talking about.
Will you illuminate the rest of us who... or was that for afterwards? Dave?
Go on the internet.
All right. We'll do that in the bar. We can continue this discussion. But I'm glad that the tool making, perhaps it has not entirely disappeared. There is a chink of hope, as you said. That's a rousing place to have ended up. Thank you all so much for coming, but more importantly, well, as importantly, thank you to our brilliant panellists this evening for sharing it.